the first phase of the revolution has now started. The king's absolute authority is gone. He has agreed that he must deal on some level with the National Assembly as an equal partner, just like the King of Britain has to deal with Parliament. He must ask the National Assembly to pass laws to raise taxes and so on and so forth. So technically, absolute monarchy in France is over beginning in the summer of 1789. The king must negotiate with the National Assembly. Now you would think that this is the end of the story. Everything is great now. No more absolute monarchy. The king is negotiating with the people. The people are represented in the National Assembly. And all people are now treated as equal citizens, according to the laws passed in the summer of 1789. But what's the problem? If there's one common thing about the French Revolution is there is the idea of equality, there is the idea of representative government, and then those ideas filter down to the regular, everyday, common working people, and they interpret it slightly differently, and then there's tension about what does the French Revolution really mean, and who should actually have the power. Now, in this first phase of the French Revolution, the belief was the third estate, the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, the people that have the education, the wealth, all that stuff, that have no political power, they must have political power. And they got that with the creation of the National Assembly. But as soon as they took power, they started passing laws which alienated a number of people. And this led to a second and more extreme phase of the French Revolution that involved far more bloodshed. The first phase of the French Revolution, the stuff that we were talking about, the storming of the Bastille, the Great Fear, that involved bloodshed, but not like what's going to happen in the next 15 to 20 years. So let me explain. This new group of people, the National Assembly, everybody that was sitting in the National Assembly were men of property. Whether they were members of the bourgeoisie, rich farmers, bankers, educators, members of the nobility, or members of the clergy, all of them now, the one thing they had in common was they all had wealth or land, which means they had nothing in common with poor people. So the laws that they put into practice benefited men of property. For instance, the National Assembly passed laws that guaranteed equality, meaning everybody has to obey the law, everybody is equally punishable by the law in the same way. But it doesn't guarantee democracy. The National Assembly, the people who could vote for the National Assembly all had to have a certain amount of property, because the belief was the poor were not independent or capable enough to vote, to have a vote. This was not an uncommon point of view. Even in America at this time, not all white men had the vote, even though they spoke the talk of democracy and equality. Secondly, the economy. As members of the bourgeoisie, as people that were schooled in all those ideas of the Enlightenment about freedom and free trade, like Adam Smith, all the laws passed by the National Assembly benefited men of property. They put an economy of free trade in place. Well, what does that mean? As a poor person, you're not crazy about free trade. Why? Because free competition in the international marketplace means the government cannot interfere in the economy at all. Well, why is that important? The government is not allowed to control the price of bread or the price of food. If food prices go up because of wars or famine or a bad harvest, in the past, governments were capable of saying to bakers, you can't charge that much for bread. It is simply, you're starving the people. But now in this new government of free trade, government's totally hands off the economy, which means price of food goes up, taxes are still up, the people are still suffering. Lastly, church policy. Many of the people that sat in the National Assembly read their John Locke on separation of church and state. They read their Voltaire that said churches are the most corrupt organizations in the history of humankind, and they must be rigorously controlled. So, the National Assembly passed a number of laws that attempted to control the power of the church in France. For instance, the churches owned a lot of land. In order to pay down the French debt, the National Assembly decided churches don't need all this land. We are seizing all the extra land that you have, and we're going to sell it on the open market and use the proceeds to pay for the debt. Additionally, the clergy, because they are mostly Catholic, their ultimate allegiance is not to the government of France, but to the head of their church, the Pope in Rome. So part of the church policy of the National Assembly was to force clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the government of France. This is problematic. If you're a Catholic, your ultimate allegiance in your faith is to the head of your church, the Pope. And now they were trying to make them subservient to the government of France. All of this series of policies in the first year of the French Revolution, 1789, 1790, meant that the revolutionary government was alienating everybody. It upset Catholics, it upset poor people, it upset workers, it upset people in the cities, it upset people in the countryside. The only people that were happy were people that had property and benefited from a government that protected property. And it certainly upset women, because of all this talk about equality, women were purposely led on the side. For instance, there is a document out there called the French Declaration of the Rights of Women. And this woman, Olympe de Gouges, took the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and throughout the whole document wrote down, and women, and women, and women, to make it clear that equality is not just for men, it's for all of humanity. Well, she was considered too extreme in her views on equality and ultimately executed. So, this gives you a sense. So, in this period, 1790, you had the beginnings of counter-revolution. The French Revolution always had enemies. Nobles and clergymen that didn't like the way things were changing, supporters of the king that didn't like the way things were changing, but now they got more and more allies because of some of these policies passed by the National Assembly. Which takes us to this, the second phase of the French Revolution, beginning in 1791 and extending to 1794. Here, things get much crazier, because the common people, the way they rose up in the summer of 1794 against the government and said, we want more reforms now. Now the people are rising up and demanding more reforms now, and they're not taking any excuses. So why did the revolution become more extreme beginning in 1791? Well, first of all, the king. In the summer of 1791, he tried to escape. He wanted to keep his absolute monarchy intact, and he felt the only way to do so was to escape the country, go to a neighboring country where he had allies, other absolute kings, use their armies to invade France and crush the revolution. That was the goal. Escape France, bring in a foreign army to crush the revolution so he could be put back in absolute control. He was caught on the border of France, and it was immediately discovered what his plan was. So people now who had been struggling to create a constitutional monarchy like Britain had freaked out, because they realized all this work to try and build a government where the king and the National Assembly are partners, is a failure. The king doesn't want to play. So what do? We can't just invent a new king. We're stuck with the one we have. But he doesn't want to be a part of this new system of government. What makes things even worse is that the neighboring countries of Austria and Prussia, who are absolute monarchies, they threaten the French people with invasion if they harm the King of France. So now you have the fear of enemies inside of France and the fear of enemies outside of France coming together. And all of this is happening when France is going through a new election season. In September of 1791, the National Assembly comes to an end. There are elections for a new body called the Legislative Assembly, basically the same thing but a different name. But this election season takes place in a period of incredible anxiety. So the voters elect representatives to this government, the Legislative Assembly, that are much more extreme, much more protective of the French Revolution, and much more uncompromising with the enemies of the French Revolution. Meaning, in April of 1792, in order to protect the revolution from foreign enemies, France declares war on Austria and Prussia, its two neighboring states. And the belief was, if France can conquer its enemies and spread its democratic ideals, then the French Revolution will survive because it has more and more allies out there. The allies of the the enemies of the French Revolution are the absolute monarchies. To save France, we must destroy absolutism in Europe. This was a problem. Yes, Karen?
At the time when they did this, where was the king? And you said they caught him on the border, but where was he? Was he put in prison or something?
House arrest.
Oh, okay.
In his lovely palace of Versailles.
Okay.
So, he was at home, but he wasn't allowed to go anywhere.
Okay.
So why was the war a big mistake? When the French Revolution happened, many people loyal to the king fled the country because they didn't want to be part of this new system of government. But many of these people who fled the country happened to be the generals and the officers of the French army. So when France declared war against Austria and Prussia, many of its most skilled officers had left the country. So France was beginning a war with a bunch of very junior, untrained officers against incredibly well-skilled professional armies. The result was, in the very first few months of the war, the French armies were completely overrun. And it looked like France would be invaded, they would be defeated, and absolutism would be reimposed on France by foreign governments. At this point, the Legislative Assembly becomes more and more concerned. It takes more and more extreme measures. For instance, in August of 1792, just a few months after the war is declared, the king and his family, in response to Karen's question, are now actually imprisoned. They're no longer in house arrest, they're actually imprisoned, because if they are the goal to put those people back in charge, then they have to be kept under lock and key. And they were. Secondly, as the monarchy was now imprisoned, the duties of the king are suspended. Technically, France now is a republic. They no longer have a king in authority because he's been arrested. He no longer is a member of the government because he doesn't want to play ball. In September of 1792, the people of Paris, the same group of people that rose up in violent action in the summer of 1789, rise up again. In the summer of 1789, they were afraid the king was taking away their revolution. In September 1792, they were afraid the invading armies of Austria and Prussia were taking away their revolution. So they rose up, they invaded the government office, the government building itself, and they essentially forced the sitting government to go home. They said, you guys are doing an awful job. You started this war, you can't fight it, we're about to be invaded, go home, or we'll kill you. And we demand that you call new elections where all people, all men, regardless of education or wealth, are allowed to vote. The people must be heard in this time of crisis. And so, this group replaces the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention. Now bear in mind, all of these things do the same job. The National Assembly, the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention, they're all the same thing. They are the group representing France making the laws. What makes the National Convention unique is that it was voted for by all men, regardless of wealth. So this is universal manhood suffrage. Incredibly democratic, incredibly radical. Now, once again, this election took place in a period of crisis. These guys who now sat in the National Convention were looking around. They see enemies of the revolution at home, enemies of the revolution abroad, and they decide to take extreme measures to save the revolution. First things first, King Louis XVI is the goal of the enemies of the French Revolution. Put him back in power as absolute monarch. Solution, kill the king. If there is no king to put back in power, there's no more threat. In January of 1793, the king is put on trial as a traitor to his people. He's found guilty. He is executed publicly. Now, remember when we started this semester with a discussion of Jacques Benin Bossuet and the divine right of kings, that kings are servants of God, they represent God's will? Do you remember all that?
Yeah.
And if you disagree with the king, you are not only you're breaking the law, but you're also committing a sin in a way,
Yeah.
right? How do you think people reacted when the king was actually executed? Pretty badly. And how do you think the other absolute monarchs, or even the other monarchs in the rest of Europe, reacted when the people of France executed their king? Out of their minds they were scared. Because they were thinking, if these people could do it to their king, what's to stop my people from having the idea of executing me if I raise taxes? The other major thing that this government did in order to deal with the crisis of the time was to reimpose the control of food, on the price of food. Why? Because this government recognized if the people are satisfied that they can eat, then they will support the government through virtually everything. But if the people are unhappy, if they're starving, they will rise up and throw out the government just like they threw out the previous governments. Here are some depictions of the marching of the king up the steps to the guillotine. This is just a blade which comes down. Your head is locked in here. The blade comes down, and your head falls into a basket. All right? It's an incredibly brutal, but also very quick and virtually painless way to die, because the moment that blade severs your spine, you don't feel anything, and then you're dead. And then the head was pulled out of the basket to see the body lying there. The head is pulled out of the basket to display to the crowds, soldiers, but also just regular people, that we have executed the king. This is a new day. The result was swift. The domestic enemies of the revolution, members of the church, supporters of the king, the very, very poor that felt they were being exploited by this new government, all of them rose up in rebellion, and in the west of France, the country was virtually manageable. There was so much revolution in the west of France that the government of France, housed in the capital city of Paris, lost control of half the country. That's how bad it was. So the revolution at home was the counter-revolution at home was totally out of control. In addition, now France found itself at war not just with Austria and Prussia, but Britain, Holland, and Spain also joined in because everybody was freaking out that what was happening in France was like a disease that was going to spread to the rest of Europe. And if you didn't crush it now, it would spread, and God only knows what would happen next. So, just to give you an idea, this is Europe in 1792. Here's France. They've just executed their king in January 1793. They were at war with Prussia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this big orange thing here. Now, they're at war with England, Spain, and Holland. Yeah.
Now, since they supported the American Revolution, did America support them in all this war that was going on?
That's a good question. America was divided. On the one hand, you had people that supported the French Revolution because they said, this is democracy in action, just like we had in America. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you had people that said, yes, but in America, we didn't do anywhere near this kind of killing. And how can you support a government, how can you support a movement that is engaged in this much killing? That's how Americans looked at it.
So it didn't really help them?
Well, what they did was they agreed to not get involved on either the French side or the side of their enemies, which put the Americans in a bad position because both sides would attack their shipping if they should happen to find it. Even though the Americans were neutral, both sides were looking for soldiers and supplies, so if they saw an American flag, they took it anyway. Things got pretty bad between the French and the Americans, and there was almost a war, but it didn't happen. Eventually, there was the War of 1812 between the Americans and the British, which we won. They burned down Washington, D.C., but we won the war anyway. Now, so when you look at this map, all I really want you to get a sense of was just how surrounded and overwhelmed France was, and its government was paranoid that they had to do anything to protect its revolution that was based on democracy and equality and the end of kings. So things got worse and worse. In April of 1793, the National Convention finally made a decision. You know how in this country we're familiar with the president is the executive, the guy who enforces the law? The Congress is the legislature. They're the ones that make the laws, right? At this time in France, the king has been executed, right? Yes?
Yeah.
The king was the executive. He was the guy who enforced the laws. So now France was in a situation where they had the National Convention making the laws, but they didn't have one person in charge of enforcing the laws. So they finally decided, listen, we got problems at home, we got problems overseas. We need, if not one person, a small group with absolute power to just enforce the laws and to protect France. So the National Convention created a committee, a small committee of 12 people called the Committee of Public Safety. This committee was given complete authority over the war, the economy, domestic peace, and their charge was simple: do whatever it takes to save the revolution. You have the complete freedom by this government to do whatever it takes to save the revolution. The head of the Committee of Public Safety was this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, the first name on the list over there. Maximilien Robespierre was a student of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that philosopher that I mentioned in class. The guy who said, governments must follow the will of the people, or the general will. But Robespierre was a believer that sometimes the people don't know what's good for them, and they must be forced to follow the right path. And thus, that is the general will, giving the people what they need, whether they know it or like it or not. You follow what I'm saying? So what does he do as the head of the Committee of Public Safety? Well, the very first thing that this government does is institute mass conscription. This is revolutionary. All able-bodied men between the ages of, I think, 18 and 35 were told, you are legally obligated to report for military duty. So France didn't have capable officers like its enemies did, because most of them had fled the country. But now they had the one thing its enemies did not have: millions of men that they could put on the front lines. And just like many other countries have done so, it doesn't matter how skilled the other side is. If you can keep putting troops on the front line and you're comfortable taking high casualties, inevitably you'll take out some of the other side as well. And this is what France did. Everybody fights to save the revolution, regardless of the consequences. Generals who retreat are put on trial, and if they are found guilty of abandoning their position, they're executed. So generals now, they know they can't retreat because they may get arrested and executed. They order the attack over and over and over, regardless of how much sense it makes, because they know they can't retreat. Inevitably, their enemies are worn down and they start pulling back. The second thing that the Committee of Public Safety does is they take over the economy. The entire economy is now transformed into a war economy, meaning not only is the price of food controlled so that poor people can eat, factories are told what to make. We need bullets, we need guns, we need uniforms, we need saddles for horses, we need canned goods for the soldiers. Factories are told what to make and basically what prices they could charge. The entire economy of France is mobilized for the war effort. Free trade has gone out the window. The government now completely controls the economy. What about the opposition? Instead of free speech and everybody expressing their point of view, the Committee of Public Safety authorized the arrest of anybody that was suspected of being not a supporter of the French Revolution. Yeah, Nikki. Instead of allowing free speech and free press, the Committee of Public Safety legalized the arrest of anybody suspected of not supporting the revolution. So if your neighbor called up the authorities and said, I heard my neighbor talking about how the French Revolution is a waste of time and money, you would get a visit by the authorities later that night. You would be given a trial where you have to prove that you are a supporter of the revolution. And during this time, anybody suspected of treason was given an unfair, quick trial and publicly executed to send a message to everybody: if you step out of line, this happens to you as well. Go ahead. They did them often. Thousands upon thousands of people were publicly executed to send the message. Like that picture I showed you with the guillotine and the king's head being, that was done in public on purpose to scare everybody. And finally, the big enemy of the revolution, considered by the Committee of Public Safety, was the church. The church was the place where all the enemies of the revolution would find their leadership. There was a commonality between supporters of the church's independence and enemies of the French Revolution. So the Committee of Public Safety said, enough is enough. You cannot be a citizen of France and a true Catholic. You cannot have divided loyalties. So we're going to eliminate the Catholic Church from France. We're going to shut down the churches. We're going to eliminate the teaching of Christianity. We're going to invent a new religion for people that need faith in their lives, with new names and new saints. And I know it sounds ridiculous to you, but they tried it. Yeah, go ahead.
So the kings that got executed, the people that was the followers or amongst him, what? Did they get a new king?
No.
Or, so
Once the king was executed, France was now officially a republic, a government without a king. Republics, at this point, there's only two big countries that are a republic, America and France. The Committee of Public Safety was in power from April 1793 to July 1794. They were incredibly successful. Opposition to the revolutionary government at home disappeared within a year. Everybody was dead or frightened. The enemies of France that had been invading from all sides of France were all pushed back, and now the French armies were invading their neighbors. So now that the committee was so successful, people started getting afraid. They were becoming scared because they were thinking, you are now winning the Committee of Public Safety. You have eliminated all your enemies. But Maximilian Robespierre, he keeps standing up, making these speeches about, we have enemies that we must deal with. And now everyone's looking around and thinking, who's left? You killed everybody. What, are you talking about me? What are you talking about me? I'm a supporter of the revolutionary government. How am I a problem? So this is what's happening slowly but surely. In the National Convention, the government, the actual government body, people starting to look to each other and saying, he's killed everybody else. If he's still talking about there's enemies we have to deal with, he's got to be talking about me. So now they all come together and say, we got to get rid of Maximilian Robespierre, we got to shut down the Committee of Public Safety, because those folks are never going to stop. They're going to keep finding new enemies. And we don't need this harsh system anymore. We've crushed opposition at home. We are now defeating our enemies abroad. We can cool it a bit. So now you have this new period called the Thermidorian reaction. Thermidor is named after, the names of the months were changed in order to show that France had entered a new era. So Thermidor was the new name of, what month was it? July? And so the reaction was against the revolution. There's revolution, there's reaction. So there was a reaction, sort of winding down the excesses of the revolution. Robespierre was arrested and executed in July of 1794.
That was a new name for the month.
The month. We have January, February, March, etc. They changed the names to things like Thermidor, Prairiel, it's Ventos, which in French means things like wind, sun, etc. The idea was, if you're starting a brand new world with a new system of government, a new system of beliefs, you've got to change the names of some of the most common things, like the months of the year, like the religion, etc., to get people locked into the new system. The Reign of Terror came to an end, no more arrests and mass execution. A new constitution was drawn up that was very conservative. The voting rights of the very, very poor were eliminated because the belief was the very, very poor tend to elect very extreme governments that do crazy things. So if you take away their right to vote, you can have more conservative, stable governments. And most importantly, the army, which used to be the protectors of the people, are now used by the government against the people that are rising up. Because, think about the history here. Summer of 1789, the people of Paris rise up and they push the revolution forward. September 1791, the people of Paris rise up and push the revolution forward. And they help elect the National Convention, which gives birth to the Reign of Terror. Now, when the people rise up because they lose their votes, the price of food is too high, the French government says, enough is enough. We are not going to have government done by the rebellious people. You just have to pay your taxes and obey the laws. End of story. Napoleon Bonaparte, a young general at the time, one of his jobs as he made his way up the ranks of the French army was to crush domestic opposition. He is most famous for having no problem whatsoever when the people of the city he was protecting were rising up against the high cost of food, the loss of democratic privileges. He had no problem lining up his troops, aiming the cannon on the marching French people, and opening fire on these defenseless people to scatter the uprising and send them all home, which is depicted in this etching. There's Napoleon, an actual cannon, and his troops firing into a crowd of defenseless people. And it worked. The people realized that from now on, you cannot rise up in rebellion, march down the streets, and force the government to do anything. This is now a much more conservative view of the French Revolution, a conservative history of the French Revolution. All right. It is now 1:30, and I'm tired. But let us do a little bit more so I could set you up for what you need to do in the future. Go ahead, Karen. Karen, you had your hand up, right?
Yes.
Go ahead.
The way that they were moving against the people, if you say anything, you can be killed, etc., etc. Can this be almost described similar to communism?
It can be described as any form of... All right. It's a big, broad spectrum between the people can do whatever they want and the people cannot do anything they want. And in the middle, there are governments that try to preserve a balance between order, laws, and democratic freedoms. In that spectrum, you have dictatorships like communism, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, etc. Then more on the liberal side, you've got America, where we have governments and laws, but we also have protection for the rights of the people, etc. The French Revolutionary Government in 1799, when all of this was happening, was sort of in the middle. The belief that, yes, we have rights, yes, we have laws, yes, we have voting, but we're in a time of war, and we can't have people doing whatever they want and rising up in rebellion every time taxes go up because we have to pay for this war. Because when we allow the people to do whatever they want, in the past, things have gotten completely out of control. But it is slowly inching more and more towards dictatorship as France becomes involved in more wars with more people. And this guy, Napoleon, comes to power. So let me give you a brief introduction to Napoleon as the next step in the French Revolution. I'll get right to you. And then when you read in the textbook, you'll have some context as to what I'm talking about. Kenneth.
You mentioned generals will be put on trial and executed if they left their armies.
If they retreated from the battlefield instead of attacking.
Right. Napoleon did this a few times. I don't know if when they was fighting Prussia or Russia, one of those countries. Why he didn't get executed?
Now, are you talking about Napoleon when he was already the Emperor of France? Or are you talking about Napoleon early in his career? Napoleon early in his career was pretty much successful in every major battle he fought. Even if he had minor reverses, he was so successful that people figured it was a temporary setback, and then he'd come back and win the next battle. And he always did. Later on, when he was full Emperor of France, and he was retreating, he didn't punish himself because he was the full Emperor of France. And he was retreating because he was getting beaten. So that's what maybe what you might be referring to. Okay? So let me talk a little bit about Napoleon. Here's Napoleon. Young guy, born on the island of Elba. Elba currently, no. Is it Elba? Corsica. Sorry. Man, am I tired. Corsica. He was born on the island of Corsica, which today is a possession of France. Okay? The irony, the grand irony of history is that the island of Corsica used to belong to the Republic of Genoa, an Italian state. All right? Napoleon Bonaparte given the accidents of history, he could have been born an Italian and never risen to command the French armies. Corsica belonged to Genoa just a few years before Napoleon Bonaparte was born. And if that had happened, if he had been born to Genoa, he never would have gone to French military school. He never would have been a French officer at the time of the French Revolution, when all the more experienced officers had left, and he had then been promoted because there was nobody in front of him. Everybody else left. And he never would have had the opportunity to become emperor because he was the right person at the right time in the right country if he had been born to Genoa. And it was only a matter of a couple of years. Okay? It's an accident of history. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte is the most successful French general in the history of France. He defeated everybody he fought. He brought safety to France, and he spread the French revolutionary ideas everywhere he went. When he conquered Western Germany, when he conquered Northern Italy, he spread the ideas of the French Revolution. Equality in the face of the law, the end of absolute monarchy, religious toleration. Wherever his armies went, these ideas went with him. Now, in 1799, France was once again facing invasion because they were at war with everybody. At this point, Napoleon recognizes he's an incredibly successful French general. France is in need of a savior. He goes back to France in November of 1799, and he essentially seizes control from a willing French government. The National Convention, or the legislature, the governing body of France, they look to Napoleon as the savior at a time of crisis. They make him what's called First Consul. Consul goes back to ancient Roman times, when you are the leader of the people, but you come from the people. So it's a nicer way of saying, not king, not dictator, but consul, a representative of the people. And he was first consul. There was a second and a third consul. So technically he was sharing power. But I'm not even going to give you the names of the second and third consul because they're irrelevant. They had no influence in French history or world history, unlike Napoleon. Napoleon, in his new political power, crushes his enemies within 2 years. 1802, he brings peace to Europe. He went from being a successful general to now bringing peace to all of Europe by beating all of his enemies or forcing them to sign a peace. At home, he crushes all opposition violently. But he's also smart. He also recognizes there's a lot of people that fled France and they stayed away because they're afraid if they come home, they'll be punished. So he signs a piece of paper and he says, anybody who wants to come back home, all is forgiven. End of story. Now all these nobles start coming back. French clergy, supposed enemies of the revolution, they're all coming back to France and they're bringing their money with them and their skills. He also imposes a new system of law, the Napoleonic Code, which standardizes the laws across France and finally brings protection of property, stability of government for the first time in years, and this earns him the respect of millions of Frenchmen. Things like property cannot be threatened by the government. All religions are protected by the government. No special religion is favored. Nobody is punished. Women, on the other hand, they had their position legally written as subordinate. And it took years for France to get over this particular setback. Napoleon also realized the majority of his subjects were Catholic. You can't have a French government if you're fighting with the Catholic Church. So he reached out to the Pope and he said, essentially, let's make a deal. Let's stop fighting. What do you want? What do I want? I, as Napoleon, want peace with the Church. What do you want in return? So the Pope essentially said, yes, you can have religious freedom in France, but we want you to say that Catholicism is the favored religion. Not the official, but the favored. Napoleon said, that's fine. I don't care. Also, the bishops of France, the guys that are appointed by the Pope, traditionally, we will allow you to hire and pay them so that even though they work for the Catholic Church, they're paid by the French government and they're loyal to you. That was a big one for the Pope to swallow, but he did it. The result of that was that Napoleon could now officially say that I have brought peace between the government of France and the Catholic Church. Millions of French Catholics now thought Napoleon was, the best thing ever. In 1802, he is named Consul for Life. He's no longer an elected position. He's just there forever. And in a couple of years, he holds a referendum, and he asks the French people, do you want me to be the Emperor of France? Basically a king. And they say, yeah. So now, the French Revolution that started off against the absolute monarchy of Louis XVI becomes ruled by the Emperor Napoleon. So, read the rest of the textbook and the sections on Napoleon. I'll do a quick recap the next time we meet, and I'll see you then. So hand in... No, there's nothing to hand in today, right? Oh, the revised papers. Hand in the revised papers with the first drafts behind it up front, please, on your way out.
Put them here?
Yes, please. Be careful. Yeah.